year 539 BC, the gates of the most powerful city in the world are about to open from within. But to understand how we reached this moment of betrayal, we must go back 17 years in time, to the precise instant when one man made a decision that would seal the fate of an entire civilization. Because what is about to happen in Babylon is not simply the fall of a city, it is the collapse of an entire world. If you're fascinated by these epic tales of ancient empires and want to dive deeper into history's greatest turning points, hit that subscribe button right now. It only takes a second, and it'll ensure you never miss an episode like this one. Imagine for a moment standing before the walls of Babylon in the year 556 BC. The first thing that strikes you isn't just their size, but the overwhelming sense that you're beholding something that transcends the human. These aren't simple defensive walls. They are artificial mountains of baked brick, rising more than 25 meters into the sky, so wide at their summit that 2 chariots pulled by 4 horses can pass each other without touching. The city boasts a double system of walls, an inner and an outer one, separated by a space where guards patrol day and night. Between these fortifications stretches a moat fed by the waters of the Euphrates, turning any direct assault into a suicidal fantasy. But the walls are just the beginning of this architectural marvel. As you approach the main entrance, your eyes meet the Ishtar Gate, a structure that defies any description. Every inch of its surface is clad in brilliant lapis lazuli tiles, creating a blue so intense it seems to radiate its own light under the Mesopotamian sun. Against this celestial backdrop, artisans have molded hundreds of dragons, bulls, and lions in relief with disturbing realism, their golden and white forms creating the illusion that these mythical creatures are about to leap from the walls to defend or devour you, depending on whether you're a friend or foe of Babylon. Crossing this gate is like passing through a threshold between the ordinary world and something entirely different. The processional way stretches out before you, an avenue more than 20 meters wide, paved with slabs of white limestone brought from the northern mountains. The walls flanking this ceremonial artery are decorated with the same magnificence as the gate, creating a corridor of splendor that leads directly to the spiritual heart of the city, the temple complex of Marduk. And then you see it. Rising above the rooftops, gardens, and palaces, the ziggurat Etemenanki dominates the horizon like a stepped mountain built by human ambition. Its 7 levels ascend 90 meters toward the firmament, each platform painted a different color representing a planet or a deity from the Babylonian pantheon. At its summit, bathed in the morning sun, the golden temple of Marduk shines like an impossible jewel. The Babylonians call it the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, and it's not hard to see why. This building isn't simply a place of worship. It's a physical declaration that Babylon is the axis of the cosmos, the point where the heavens meet the earth. But there's more, much more. The legendary hanging gardens rise in overlapping terraces near the royal palace, a prodigy of hydraulic engineering where trees, flowers, and exotic plants grow, brought from every corner of the known empire. Water is lifted from the Euphrates through a complex system of water wheels and channels, creating artificial cascades that descend level by level, filling the air with the constant sound of moving water. In a land where the desert heat can be deadly, these gardens offer an oasis of green freshness that seems to defy the laws of nature. The streets of Babylon buzz with a human diversity that no other city can match. Here, Phoenician merchants haggle with Indian traders. Egyptian artisans work gold alongside carpenters from the mountains of Anatolia. Akkadian scribes record transactions on clay tablets, while their Aramaic colleagues do the same on papyrus scrolls. The air is saturated with dozens of languages, the scent of exotic spices mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and the incense that burns constantly in the countless shrines scattered throughout the metropolis. This city isn't simply large, it's immense. More than 200,000 people live within its walls, a figure that makes it the most populous urban center in the known world. Its storehouses overflow with grain from the Mesopotamian plains, olive oil from the Levantine coasts, precious metals from Anatolian mines, aromatic woods from Lebanon, and ivory from Africa. Gold flows through Babylon like water through the Euphrates, accumulating in the treasures of the royal palace and the vaults of the temples until it forms mountains of wealth that would make pharaohs and kings pale. And all this magnificence accumulated over centuries rests on the foundations of the military power built by the man responsible for Babylon's current greatness, Nebuchadnezzar II. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, he left behind an empire that stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the borders of Egypt, from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. It was he who conquered Jerusalem in 587 BC, destroying Solomon's temple and deporting the Jewish elite to Babylon in what history would remember as the Babylonian captivity. It was he who transformed his capital from an important city into the absolute wonder of the ancient world, investing the riches of his conquests in building projects that had no precedent in scale or ambition. But Nebuchadnezzar also created a problem that his successors could not solve. By concentrating so much power, so much wealth, and such a diverse population in a single city, he built a structure that required an extraordinarily delicate balance to remain stable. The priesthood of Marduk had grown into a power parallel to that of the king, controlling not only the temples, but also vast stretches of agricultural land, artisan workshops, herds of cattle, and a trade network that spanned the entire empire. The priests administered justice, oversaw contracts, lent money, and educated the scribes who kept the imperial bureaucracy running. In other words, ruling Babylon didn't mean simply issuing orders from a throne. It meant constantly negotiating with a priestly class that had its own interests, its own power base, and its own ideas about how the affairs of the state and the cosmos should be handled. And this is where our story truly begins, because the man who inherited this delicately balanced empire was perhaps the least suitable person imaginable for the job. Nabonidus ascended to the throne around 556 BC under circumstances that were never entirely clear. He was not from Nebuchadnezzar's direct royal family, but came to power after a period of political instability that saw several short-lived kings occupy the throne. His mother, Adad-Gupi, was a priestess of the lunar god Sin in the city of Haran, and she seems to have been an extraordinarily influential figure whose legendary longevity, over 100 years according to some inscriptions, became a subject of awe and speculation. From the start, Nabonidus proved to be profoundly different from his predecessors. While earlier kings had carefully maintained the balance among the empire's various religious factions, Nabonidus was a passionate devotee of the lunar god Sin, and he made no secret of his preferences. The first signs of trouble emerged when Nabonidus began restoring temples to Sin throughout the empire, diverting resources that traditionally would have gone to maintaining Marduk's shrines in Babylon. For the priesthood of Marduk, this wasn't simply a matter of personal preference. It was an existential threat. For centuries, they had based their power on the fundamental premise that Marduk was the king of the gods, that Babylon was his chosen city, and that the welfare of the cosmos depended on the proper maintenance of his rituals and temples. If a king of Babylon began suggesting that another god might be equal or superior to Marduk, the entire ideological structure upholding the priestly power wobbled. But what followed was far worse than a simple redistribution of religious funds. Sometime around 552 BC, Nabonidus made a decision that his contemporaries considered utterly incomprehensible. He abandoned Babylon. Not for weeks or months. For nearly a decade, the king of Babylon lived in the oasis of Tamar in the Arabian desert, over 1,000 kilometers from his capital. He left the daily administration of the empire in the hands of his son Belshazzar, known in the Bible as Belshazzar, but he himself withdrew to this remote place for reasons that still baffle historians today. Ancient sources offer different explanations. Some inscriptions suggest Nabonidus was ill and seeking recovery in the dry desert climate. Other texts hint that he was obsessed with restoring ancient temples to Sin in Arabia. Contemporary documents speak of dreams and divine visions that compelled him to leave Babylon. But none of these explanations fully satisfy, because none justify a decade-long abandonment of the most important city in the world. And while Nabonidus pursued his projects in Arabia, Babylon began to crumble slowly from within. The Akitu festival, the New Year's celebration that was the most important religious event in the Babylonian calendar, could not be properly held. This 11-day ceremony required the physical presence of the king, who had to submit to a ritual of humiliation before Marduk's statue, being slapped by the high priest before renewing his divine mandate to rule for another year. Without the king, without the ritual, the cosmos was thrown out of balance. Or at least that's what the Babylonians believed. The consequences were both psychological and practical. For a deeply religious population, the disruption of traditional festivals was a terrifying omen that the gods were displeased. For the priesthood of Marduk, it was an intolerable humiliation that demonstrated the king's contempt for Babylon's sacred traditions. And for the general population, the prolonged absence of the monarch created a sense of abandonment and neglect that gradually eroded loyalty to the regime. But there was another factor at play, one that Nabonidus and his advisors seemed not to perceive until it was too late. While the king of Babylon withdrew to the desert, in the eastern mountains a new power was being forged that would change the course of world history. Cyrus, prince of Anshan, a subordinate region of the Median Empire, had rebelled against his grandfather, the Median king Astyages, around 553 BC. In a campaign that combined military brilliance with political cunning, Cyrus achieved the unthinkable, convincing a significant portion of the Median army to desert to his side. When Astyages' troops met Cyrus's forces in battle, they simply switched sides, delivering their own king to the Persian rebel. With Media under his control, Cyrus quickly consolidated his power over the Persian tribes and began an expansion campaign that revealed not only his military genius, but also his deep understanding of how ancient empires truly worked. Unlike the Assyrian conquerors, who ruled through terror and systematic destruction, Cyrus developed an entirely different strategy. He allowed conquered peoples to maintain their customs, their religions, and often their own local rulers, as long as they recognized his supremacy and paid tribute. This policy of tolerance wasn't simply humanitarian. It was profoundly practical. It drastically reduced the cost of maintaining an empire, because conquered peoples had fewer incentives to rebel. More importantly, it turned Cyrus into an attractive alternative for any population discontent under other rulers. And in Babylon, there were many discontented. The Jews deported by Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier had never forgotten their homeland. Generations had grown up hearing stories of Jerusalem, of the destroyed temple, of a homeland promised by their God that they would one day reclaim. They lived in Babylon, worked in Babylon, some even prospered in Babylon, but their hearts were in Judah. When rumors about Cyrus and his policy of allowing deported peoples to return to their lands began to circulate, they found very receptive audiences. But it wasn't just the exiled Jews. Nebuchadnezzar's empire had been built through conquest, and each conquest had brought deported populations to Babylon. Phoenicians, Arameans, peoples from the mountains of Anatolia, Arab tribes, all living in a magnificent city that would never truly be their home. For many of them, the prospect of a conqueror who promised restoration instead of oppression was extraordinarily tempting. And then there was the priesthood of Marduk, watching with growing alarm as Nabonidus continued to prioritize the cults of Sin over Babylonian traditions. These men weren't simple religious fanatics. They were sophisticated administrators, astute politicians who had maintained and expanded their power for generations by navigating the complexities of imperial politics. And they were perfectly capable of making pragmatic calculations about where their interests would best lie. Meanwhile, in the east, Cyrus continued his inexorable expansion. In 547 BC, he faced Croesus, the legendarily wealthy king of Lydia, whose kingdom controlled much of western Anatolia. According to Herodotus, Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi about whether he should attack Persia. The oracle replied that if he crossed the Halys River, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus interpreted this as a favorable prophecy, crossed the river, and indeed destroyed a great empire. His own. The conquest of Lydia not only dramatically expanded Persian territory, but put Cyrus in control of the Greek cities on the Anatolian coast, giving him access to the Mediterranean and the cultural and technological sophistication of the Greek world. More importantly, it demonstrated that no kingdom in the Near East could face Persia in open battle and expect to survive, which raised an obvious question. Who would be next? The borders of the Persian and Babylonian empires now touched along the Tigris River. It was only a matter of time before the inevitable clash occurred. And when Nabonidus finally returned to Babylon around 543 BC, after nearly a decade of absence, he found a city that greeted him not with celebration, but with barely contained resentment. The king tried to repair the damage. The Akitu festivals were resumed, though with palpable tension between the monarch and the priesthood of Marduk. Building projects were initiated to show that Babylon was still a priority. Military defenses were reinforced against the increasingly evident Persian threat. But there were things that couldn't be repaired so easily. Trust once lost is extraordinarily difficult to recover. And the trust between Nabonidus and the priesthood of Marduk was irreparably broken. The priests had spent 10 years consolidating their opposition to the king, developing networks of contacts among the discontented nobility, and probably, though this was never explicitly stated in the surviving documents, establishing communications with the Persians. Because Cyrus was too intelligent to simply attack Babylon head-on, he knew that assaulting the most formidable walls in the ancient world, defended by one of the largest and best-equipped armies of the era, would be extraordinarily costly, even if successful. But he also knew something more important, that the thickest walls and the largest armies are useless if the gates open from within. And while Nabonidus desperately tried to restore order in his fractured empire, Cyrus was patiently building the network of alliances, promises, and commitments that would transform his eventual invasion of Babylon from a conquest into a liberation. At least, that's how the Persians and their Babylonian allies would present it when the time finally came. In the year 540 BC, the signs of the approaching storm were unmistakable. Border garrisons reported Persian troop movements. Merchants brought news that Cyrus was concentrating resources and preparing his army for a major campaign. Babylonian diplomats in other kingdoms' courts returned with grim reports about how potential allies were assessing the balance of power and reaching conclusions unfavorable to Babylon. Nabonidus was not a complete fool. He understood that a crisis was approaching. He ordered reinforcements for the garrisons along the Tigris. He summoned troops from distant provinces. He stockpiled supplies in Babylon to withstand a prolonged siege. He performed elaborate sacrifices in the temples, seeking the divine favor that seemed to have been withdrawn from him. But there was a fundamental problem that no amount of military preparation could solve. An army only fights when it believes in what it's defending. And more Babylonians were wondering if it was really worth defending Nabonidus's regime, or if perhaps Cyrus, with his promises of restoration and tolerance, might offer something better. This is the central paradox of what is about to happen. Babylon will not fall because it is weak. It will fall because, at the crucial moment, when it most needs the absolute loyalty of its subjects, too many of them will have decided that their interests lie elsewhere. And so, as the summer of 539 BC comes to an end, and the harvests are gathered in the fields of Mesopotamia, two armies begin to move toward a clash that will determine the fate not only of Babylon, but of the entire region for centuries to come. But before a single battle is fought, before a drop of blood is shed, the real decisions have already been made. In the halls of Marduk's temples, in whispered conversations among the Babylonian nobility, in the silent calculations of provincial governors assessing which way the winds of change are blowing. The fate of the world's most powerful empire is being sealed. And Nabonidus, sitting in his magnificent palace, surrounded by the most impressive walls ever built, commanding an army that should be invincible, still does not fully comprehend that he has lost something far more important than any battle. He has lost the faith of his people, and in the ancient world, where God spoke through priests and cosmic order manifested in sacred rituals, a king who has lost the trust of his priests is already defeated, no matter how many soldiers he commands or how thick his walls are. The question is no longer whether Babylon will fall. The question is when and how and who will open the gates. September 539 BC. The largest army ever assembled under a single banner is crossing the Diyala River. It's not the size of this force that should terrify the Babylonians, it's its composition. Because marching under Cyrus's orders are not simply Persians. There are Medes, once their enemies and now their most loyal allies. There are troops from the Greek cities of Ionia, with their superior armament and phalanx tactics. There are contingents from Lydia, Armenia, the tribes of the Zagros Mountains. There are even units of Egyptian mercenaries, men who have traveled thousands of kilometers to serve a conqueror whose reputation for paying generously and treating his soldiers well has spread throughout the known world. But what is truly remarkable about this army isn't just its diversity, it's the fact that it works. Cyrus has achieved what seemed impossible, forging a coherent military machine from dozens of different peoples, each with their own martial traditions, their own equipment, their own languages. And he has done it through a combination of iron discipline and pragmatic flexibility, allowing each contingent to fight according to its own methods, while maintaining a unified command structure that can coordinate their movements with devastating precision. The first real sign that something terrible is happening reaches Babylon in late September, when exhausted messengers ride through the gates with news from the north. The Persian army has crossed the Diyala, a tributary of the Tigris that effectively marks the northern border of Mesopotamia's heartland. They have done so through a feat of engineering that leaves Babylonian observers astonished. Instead of seeking a ford or building vulnerable bridges, Persian engineers have dug diversion channels, temporarily reducing the river's flow enough to allow the army to cross at places that would normally be too deep. This isn't simply a demonstration of technical skill, it's a calculated message. Cyrus is announcing that no natural barrier can stop him, that the Persian Empire possesses not only the brute force of a great army, but also the organizational sophistication and technical knowledge to overcome any obstacle. And if he can divert rivers, what else can he do? Nabonidus responds as any king facing an invasion must. He orders general mobilization, provincial garrisons receive orders to concentrate, messengers are sent to allied cities requesting reinforcements. Temples are instructed to perform continuous sacrifices, praying for victory. Storehouses are opened and weapons distributed. The streets of Babylon fill with the sound of thousands of soldiers preparing for war. But there's something strange about this mobilization, something that attentive observers might notice if they knew what to look for. Not all contingents respond with the expected enthusiasm. Some units arrive late. Others report suspiciously low troop numbers. Provincial commanders send messages explaining why they can't send as many soldiers as requested, citing local threats or logistical problems that sound plausible, but taken together begin to create a worrying pattern. Nabonidus doesn't have time to worry about these details. The Persian forces are advancing southward at an alarming speed, and he needs to stop them before they penetrate too deeply into Mesopotamia's heart. He decides to make his defensive stand at Opis, a strategically located city at the confluence of the Diyala and Tigris rivers, about 80 kilometers north of Babylon. The choice has solid military logic. Opis controls the Tigris crossing, and its position at the meeting of two rivers means any army trying to pass must expose itself to attack from a defensible position. Plus, it's far enough from Babylon to provide maneuvering space, but close enough to allow an orderly retreat to the capital if things go wrong. What Nabonidus doesn't know, what he can't know as he watches his troops take positions along the Tigris banks, is that the Battle of Opis is already lost before it begins. Not due to numerical inferiority or tactical disadvantage, but because a significant portion of his own commanders has already decided they won't fight very hard to defend a regime in which they've lost faith. The exact details of what happened at Opis are frustrating to reconstruct, because the surviving ancient sources are fragmentary and biased. The Babylonian chronicles that systematically recorded important events are damaged precisely in the sections describing the battle. Persian sources, naturally, magnify Cyrus's victory. Greek historians who wrote about these events did so centuries later, drawing on oral traditions that had been embellished and distorted with each retelling. But we can reconstruct the essentials. Sometime in early October 539 BC, Persian and Babylonian forces clashed near Opis. The battle likely lasted several days, with intense fighting as units from both sides battled for control of key positions along the river. And then something broke. Perhaps it was a specific unit that withdrew at a crucial moment, creating a breach in the Babylonian line. Perhaps it was a commander who interpreted an ambiguous order in the most conservative way possible, preserving his troops when he should have risked everything in an attack. Perhaps it was simply the cumulative effect of dozens of small decisions, each individually justifiable, that together created a cascade of failures, transforming a hard-fought battle into a catastrophic defeat. The Babylonian chronicles record the outcome with the grim brevity of defeat. Babylon's troops were defeated at Opis, and there was a great slaughter. They then add a detail that is both cryptic and revealing. The population of Opis was looted by Persian troops as the Babylonian army retreated in disorder. This detail is significant because it suggests there was no prolonged defense of the city after the field battle. Opis simply fell, and its population paid the price. But more importantly, the sacking of Opis represented a calculated warning from Cyrus to other cities in Mesopotamia. They could resist and face destruction, or they could surrender and receive clemency. The choice was theirs. And as the defeated Babylonian army retreated southward, the cities of Mesopotamia began making precisely that calculation. Sippar was the first to fall. This ancient city, located north of Babylon on the Euphrates, was one of Mesopotamia's most important religious centers, home to the great temple of the sun god Shamash. When Persian advance forces approached, Sippar's leaders made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. They opened their gates. There was no battle, no siege, no destruction. Persian troops simply entered, and Sippar changed hands as peacefully as if it were a commercial transaction rather than a military conquest. The chronicles record that this happened on October 10th, 539 BC, just days after the Battle of Opis. For Nabonidus, Sippar's surrender without a fight must have been more devastating than the military defeat at Opis, because it demonstrated something he had probably feared but hoped not to face: that his own subjects preferred Persian conquest to continuing under his rule. The king then made a decision that historians have debated for millennia. He fled, not toward Babylon, where he might have organized a defense behind impenetrable walls, not southward, where more loyal provinces might have provided a base for continued resistance. He simply vanished from the historical record for several critical days, reappearing finally in Persian hands after Babylon's fall. Why did he flee? The sources don't explain satisfactorily. Perhaps he recognized the cause was lost and sought to save his life. Perhaps he was abandoned by his own troops and had no choice. Perhaps he suffered a nervous breakdown in the face of the unfolding disaster's magnitude. Whatever the reason, his flight left Babylon without its king at the moment of greatest peril, which meant that the defense of the world's most powerful city fell to Belshazzar, Nabonidus' son, who had served as regent during his father's absence in Arabia. Belshazzar was, by all accounts, a competent man. He had administered the empire for nearly a decade, while his father pursued projects in the desert. He knew the machinery of government, maintained relations with the Babylonian nobility, and understood the military challenges he faced. but he was also the son of an unpopular king, associated with all the controversial religious policies that had alienated the priesthood of Marduk. And now, as Persian forces approached Babylon with the inexorable certainty of a tide, Belshazzar had to make decisions that would determine not only his own fate, but that of an entire civilization. The military situation seemed, superficially, to favor the defenders. Babylon wasn't simply a fortified city. It was a fortress that had withstood sieges for centuries. Its walls had been designed by the best military engineers of past generations, built and rebuilt to a level of defensive sophistication unmatched in the ancient world. The Euphrates flowed directly through the city's center, providing an inexhaustible supply of fresh water that made surrender by thirst impossible. The storehouses were crammed with grain, enough to feed the population for years. The walls were garrisoned by thousands of soldiers, and additional reinforcements had been brought from provinces that remained loyal. More importantly, the city had a defensive system designed specifically to protect against the one obvious vulnerability, the river running through it. Where the Euphrates entered and exited the city, massive reinforced bronze gates could be lowered to the riverbed, creating barriers that would prevent an attacking force from using the waterway as an entry point. These gates were operated by complex systems of pulleys and counterweights, and were designed to close automatically in emergencies. In theory, Babylon was impregnable. In practice, everything depended on something far more fragile than bronze or brick: the defender's will to actually defend. And this is where our story becomes extraordinarily complicated, because different ancient sources tell fundamentally different versions of what happened next. The contemporary Mesopotamian chronicles, written on cuneiform tablets by Babylonian scribes, offer a sober and minimalist version. They record that on October 12, 539 BC, Cyrus's troops under the command of Gobryas, governor of Gutium, entered Babylon without battle. They specify that there was no interruption of temple rituals, no significant destruction occurred, and the transition of power was remarkably peaceful. This version is important because it represents the official Babylonian record, written by people who were present or very close to the events. They had no particular incentive to make the Persian conquest seem smoother than it was, suggesting it indeed was relatively bloodless. But then we have the Greek historians, primarily Herodotus and Xenophon, writing decades or centuries later, who tell a much more dramatic story. According to these sources, Cyrus employed an ingenious stratagem to take the city. His engineers dug diversion channels upstream, reducing the Euphrates' flow as it passed through Babylon. As the water level dropped, Persian soldiers marched along the riverbed, passing under the water gates that hadn't been lowered properly, and emerged inside the city before the defenders realized what was happening. Xenophon adds an extraordinarily specific detail. The Persians timed their infiltration to coincide with a great festival in Babylon, when the population was celebrating and the guards were less alert than usual. According to this version, Persian soldiers penetrated deep into the city before an alarm was raised, taking control of entire districts, while the inebriated Babylonians barely noticed they were being conquered. So which version is correct? As often happens with ancient history, the answer likely incorporates elements of both. Archaeological evidence and contemporary documents strongly support that there was no massive battle for Babylon. There are no destruction layers in the archaeological strata corresponding to 539 BC. No evidence of massive fires or demolitions. Commercial archives continue uninterrupted through the power transition. All this confirms the Mesopotamian chronicles. Babylon changed hands remarkably peacefully. But the story of the diverted river and the nocturnal infiltration, though perhaps embellished in the Greek versions, has plausible elements. Persian engineers had demonstrated their ability to manipulate rivers when crossing the Diyala. The Euphrates in Babylon, during the dry season of October, could have been reduced to a wadable level with sufficient upstream engineering. And we know that a portion of the Persian army under Gobryas did indeed enter the city. So, here's what likely happened. reconstructed from the various sources and supplemented with military logic. In the days leading up to October 12th, while Persian forces established positions around Babylon, Cyrus and his commanders were conducting intense secret negotiations with factions inside the city. The priesthood of Marduk, who had resented Nabonidus for years, saw in Cyrus an opportunity to restore their influence. In exchange for guarantees that their temples would be respected and their privileges maintained, they would provide something invaluable: information about the city's defenses and, potentially, active cooperation in its capture. Provincial governors and military commanders inside Babylon faced their own calculus. Nabonidus had fled. Belshazzar, though present, lacked the widespread support needed to organize an effective defense. The Persian army was overwhelmingly superior in numbers and had proven its ability to defeat Babylonian forces in open field. Resisting would mean a prolonged siege that would likely end in defeat anyway, but only after months of deprivation and with the risk that the Persians would sack the city when it finally fell. On the other hand, there was substantial evidence that Cyrus treated cities that surrendered peacefully well. Sippar had opened its gates and hadn't been destroyed. The Persians had respected temples and properties in other conquered cities, and the promises Cyrus had circulated, respecting local religions and allowing deported peoples to return home, sounded genuine. So, when Persian engineers began diverting the Euphrates upstream, reducing the flow through Babylon, those responsible for operating the defensive water gates simply didn't close them completely. Perhaps they justified this by telling themselves the water level was still too high for anyone to pass. Perhaps they knew exactly what they were doing. Either way, on the night of October 12, 539 BC, an advance force of Persian troops under Gobryas entered Babylon, likely through the Enlil Gate in the city's western sector, where the river was more accessible. Some soldiers may indeed have marched through the partially dry riverbed. Others were probably simply admitted through gates that opened from within. Once inside, they moved quickly to secure key points. Temples were occupied, not to loot them, but to ensure they were protected. Palaces were surrounded. Armories were captured. All this was done with an efficiency that suggests detailed planning and, likely, local guides who knew exactly where to go. Resistance was minimal because most Babylonians, waking to find Persians in the streets, simply stayed in their homes and waited to see what would happen. There wasn't enough loyalty to Belshazzar or Nabonidus's regime to inspire spontaneous civilian defense, and Babylonian soldiers, seeing their commanders not organizing coordinated resistance, chose to preserve their own lives rather than die, defending a seemingly lost cause. But there was at least one place where resistance did occur: the royal palace. According to the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible, Belshazzar was holding a banquet on the night Babylon fell. During the feast, a hand appeared and wrote mysterious words on the wall. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The prophet Daniel was called to interpret the message and explained that it meant Belshazzar's kingdom had been weighed, found wanting, and was being divided between the Medes and Persians. That same night, the biblical text records, Belshazzar was executed. Now, the book of Daniel was written centuries after these events and contains clearly legendary elements. The handwriting on the wall is obviously supernatural and ahistorical, but the core of the account, that Belshazzar was eliminated during the night of the conquest, may well be historical. Xenophon provides additional details, though equally hard to verify. According to his account, Persian forces found Belshazzar in the royal palace, surrounded by his loyal guards. Combat ensued, and the last effective ruler of Babylon lost his life in the fighting. If this is accurate, it makes military sense. Belshazzar, knowing he represented everything Cyrus needed to eliminate to consolidate control, would have been less willing to surrender peacefully than the priests of Marduk or military commanders who could expect to preserve their positions under the new regime. It also makes sense from Cyrus's perspective. Allowing Belshazzar to live would have created a potential focal point for future resistance. It was cleaner, more decisive, to simply eliminate him during the conquest's confusion. Not a formal execution that might create a martyr, but a death in combat that could be presented as the regrettable but inevitable result of his refusal to surrender. And so, as the sun rose over Babylon on October 13, 539 BC, the inhabitants of the world's greatest city awoke to discover that everything had changed. Persian soldiers patrolled the streets, but they weren't looting or destroying. Temples were open and their priests performing normal rituals, only now under Persian protection. Trade continued. Everyday life went on. But the empire was over. Cyrus, demonstrating the political instinct that characterized him, did not enter Babylon immediately. He waited 17 days, allowing Gobryas and his subordinates to stabilize the situation, ensure no ongoing violence, and begin securing the cooperation of local elites. During this period, something extraordinary happened. The Babylonian elites, especially the priesthood of Marduk, began a project of historical propaganda that completely rewrote the narrative of what had just occurred. We know this because the resulting document, the Cyrus cylinder, survived. Discovered in the 19th century during excavations in Babylon, this clay cylinder inscription presents a version of events that is both fascinating and revealing. According to the Cyrus cylinder, the gods of Babylon were deeply displeased with Nabonidus. They had searched the world for a just ruler who could restore divine order in Mesopotamia. They found Cyrus, prince of Anshan, and called him by name to liberate Babylon from its oppressor. The text goes on to describe how Marduk himself took Cyrus's hand and led him to Babylon, where the people received him with joy. There was no battle because the gods had decreed that Cyrus was the legitimate ruler. The conquest wasn't a foreign invasion, but a divine restoration of the proper order. This is top-tier propaganda, but propaganda that tells us something crucial about how power worked in the ancient world. It wasn't enough for Cyrus to simply conquer Babylon through military force. He needed to be accepted as legitimate by the existing power structure, especially the priesthood that controlled the population's religious loyalty. And the priesthood of Marduk, in turn, needed to rewrite history to explain why they had so quickly accepted a foreign conqueror. They couldn't simply admit they had betrayed Nabonidus for self-interest. Instead, they built a narrative where they hadn't betrayed anyone because Nabonidus had never been the true king. Cyrus, chosen by the gods, was the legitimate ruler, and they had simply recognized divine will. On October 29, 539 BC, 17 days after Gobryas took the city, Cyrus finally made his entry into Babylon, and he was received with ceremony. The streets were carpeted with green branches, a Babylonian tradition for honoring victorious conquerors. The priesthood of Marduk came out in procession to meet the new king, carrying the sacred symbols of their office. The population lined the streets, not exactly celebrating perhaps, but not resisting either. Cyrus, demonstrating the political skill that had brought him so far, behaved not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate Babylonian ruler. He submitted to the traditional rituals of royal power-taking. He took the hands of Marduk's statue, the ceremonial act that confirmed a new king. He adopted the traditional titles: King of Babylon, King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the four quarters of the world. But more significantly, he issued proclamations fulfilling the promises he had been circulating for months. Temples would receive royal support and protection. The images of gods that Nabonidus had brought to Babylon from other cities would be returned to their original shrines. Deported peoples could return to their lands. For the Jews in exile, this last promise was particularly momentous. Generations had passed since Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and deported its inhabitants to Babylon. Now, this Persian king, who had never seen Judah, was offering them the chance to return and rebuild their temple. The book of Ezra in the Hebrew Bible records Cyrus's edict. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. Not all Jews took up this offer. Many had established lives in Babylon, with prosperous businesses and settled families. Returning to Judah meant abandoning the security of the familiar for the uncertainty of rebuilding amid ruins. But enough did return to begin the process of restoration that would eventually lead to the rebuilding of Jerusalem's temple and the reconstitution of the Jewish community in its ancestral land. This aspect of Cyrus's policies has led some to call him the liberator, the enlightened ruler whose religious and ethnic tolerance was centuries ahead of his time. Jewish tradition venerates him as a Messiah anointed by God. The prophet Isaiah, in passages that may have been written during or shortly after these events, refers to Cyrus as God's shepherd and his anointed. But we need to be careful not to over-idealize Cyrus. He wasn't acting out of abstract altruism or modern principles of human rights. He was a brilliant politician who understood that ruling a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire required flexibility and pragmatism. Keeping deported peoples away from their ancestral lands required military garrisons to prevent rebellions, administrators to oversee them, and constant resources to manage resentful populations. Allowing them to return eliminated this administrative burden and created grateful communities that would have good reasons to support the Persian regime against any future Babylonian reconquest attempts. Similarly, respecting local temples and their priesthoods wasn't simply religious generosity. Temples were enormously powerful economic institutions that controlled land, trade, and population loyalty. Winning their cooperation was far more efficient than trying to rule against their opposition. In other words, Cyrus's policy of tolerance was as much pragmatic strategy as moral principle. But that doesn't make it less remarkable. Many earlier conquerors had ruled through the systematic destruction of local institutions, the imposition of their own religion and culture, and the brutal crushing of any resistance. Cyrus demonstrated that a viable alternative existed that could create more stable and prosperous empires. What happened to Nabonidus? The sources provide contradictory information. Some traditions suggest he was captured and exiled to Carmania, a region in eastern Persia, where he lived out his days under Persian custody. Other sources hint that he may have met a more violent end. What is certain is that he vanished from the historical stage. The last native king of Babylon ended his days in obscurity, a grim reminder of how one individual's decisions, however well-intentioned, can trigger catastrophic consequences. Because it's important to recognize that Nabonidus probably wasn't a monster. The religious reforms he implemented, honoring the lunar god Sin, reflected genuine personal convictions. His retreat to Tama may have been motivated by reasons he considered valid, whether illness, religious visions, or projects he believed important. There's no evidence he was particularly cruel or tyrannical compared to other rulers of his era. But by breaking the delicate balance between royal and priestly power, by marginalizing Marduk and his clergy, by absenting himself from Babylon for a decade at a time when external threats were growing, he committed strategic errors that made his empire vulnerable. And in the unforgiving world of ancient Near Eastern power politics, strategic errors were paid for with destruction. For Babylon itself, paradoxically, the Persian conquest didn't mean immediate end. The city continued as a major metropolis for centuries. It remained one of the Persian Empire's administrative capitals. Temples kept functioning. Trade prospered. Babylonian cultural life continued without dramatic interruption. But something fundamental had changed. Babylon was no longer the center of the world. It was a provincial city in an empire stretching from Egypt to India, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. Decisions affecting its fate were now made by Persian kings in Susa or Ecbatana, not by Babylonian rulers in the palace by the Euphrates. And over time, this shift became more pronounced. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire 2 centuries later, he considered making Babylon his capital, but died before implementing the plan. His successors founded new cities, especially Seleucia on the Tigris, which gradually eclipsed Babylon in commercial and political importance. The city that had been the world's center for over 1,000 years began a long decline. Temples fell into disuse as Christianity and then Islam replaced ancient religions. Canals bringing water from the Euphrates clogged and weren't repaired. Population dwindled. Buildings crumbled. By the medieval period, Babylon was little more than a mound of ruins in the desert, remembered mainly through biblical references to its legendary wickedness and fall. Arab travelers reported strange hills covered in pottery shards and occasional brick walls protruding from the sand, but they didn't recognize they were walking over the remains of the ancient world's most magnificent city. It wasn't until the 19th century, when European archaeologists began systematic excavations, that Babylon started emerging from the earth. And what they found was both impressive and melancholic. The massive walls were still there, though collapsed in many places. The Ishtar Gate was unearthed with its bright tiles still intact after millennia buried. The ziggurat, though reduced to its foundations, still revealed the monumental scale of its original construction. But more significantly, they found thousands of cuneiform tablets, commercial and administrative archives documenting everyday life in ancient Babylon. And it was through these documents that modern scholars could reconstruct the story of how the empire fell. So, what does the fall of Babylon teach us about the nature of political power and the fate of empires? First, it reminds us that military strength, while important, is never sufficient on its own. Babylon had impressive walls, a numerous army, and abundant resources. But it fell because it lost something more fundamental: the loyalty of its own subjects. The thickest walls are useless if the gates open from within. The largest armies are ineffective if the soldiers don't believe in what they're defending. Second, it demonstrates the critical power of religious institutions in pre-modern societies. The conflict between Nabonidus and the priesthood of Marduk wasn't simply an abstract theological dispute. It was a struggle for control of enormous material resources and population loyalty. When Nabonidus lost this struggle, he lost the ability to govern effectively, even though he retained the royal title. Third, it illustrates how propaganda and narrative can be as important as material facts in determining historical outcomes. Cyrus won Babylon as much through his careful construction of an image as a liberator as through his military skill. The Cyrus cylinder, with its rewriting of the conquest as divine restoration, was a political tool as important as any weapon in his arsenal. Fourth, it shows us that empires collapse not only when attacked by stronger external enemies, but when internal tensions have weakened them to the point where they can no longer maintain the cohesion needed to resist. Babylon didn't fall primarily because Persia was militarily superior, but because decades of problematic political decisions had eroded the base of Babylonian power. And finally, the fall of Babylon marked a massive geopolitical turning point. For over 1,200 years, from the rise of the Akkadian Empire in the 3rd millennium BC to the Persian conquest in 539 BC, Mesopotamia had been the center of world power. Dynasties had changed, empires had risen and fallen, but political and cultural power had remained centered in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. The Persian conquest fundamentally changed this. The political center of gravity shifted eastward to the Iranian plateau. And though Babylon remained important for centuries, it never regained its central position. The future would belong to empires built from Persia, then to the Hellenistic kingdoms founded by Alexander's successors, then to Rome operating from the Mediterranean. In this sense, October 12th, 539 BC doesn't mark just the fall of a city. It marks the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in human history that had lasted millennia. The Semitic peoples, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, had dominated the Near East for 3,000 years. Now, Indo-European peoples, Persians, Greeks, and eventually Romans, would rule these lands for the next 1,000 years. And it all began with gates that opened from within, with priests who decided their interests lay with the foreign invader rather than their native king, with a conqueror smart enough to understand that true victory comes not from destroying your enemies, but from turning them into allies. When we look at the ruins of Babylon today, mounds of earth in the Iraqi desert marked by archaeological digs, it's hard to imagine this was once the center of the civilized world. But the cuneiform tablets in museums, the bright tiles of the reconstructed Ishtar Gate in Berlin, and the biblical references that have kept Babylon's name alive for millennia all testify to a fundamental truth. Empires, no matter how powerful, are human constructs sustained by collective belief in their legitimacy and necessity. When that belief erodes, when the elites who administer them decide their interests lie elsewhere, when the population loses faith that the existing order serves their needs, no wall is high enough, no army large enough to preserve them. Babylon fell not in a day, but over years of decisions that gradually undermined its internal cohesion. The Persian conquest was simply the moment when this internal disintegration became visible and irreversible. And in this, the fall of Babylon provides a lesson that has been relevant for every empire since, and remains relevant for power structures in our own time. Power is not maintained solely by force. It is maintained by consent, legitimacy, and the shared belief that the existing order, with all its imperfections, serves the common good better than the alternatives. When that belief dies, when elites lose confidence in their own system, when populations begin to imagine alternative futures, then even the mightiest empire is living on borrowed time. And so, the city that was once the navel of the world, the metropolis that had defied empires for centuries, the Babylon of impossible walls and legendary gardens, ended not with an epic battle, but with gates that opened silently in the night, betrayed not by weakness, but by the calculated decision of its own elites that the future lay elsewhere. This is the true story of how Babylon fell, and it is perhaps the story of how all empires ultimately fall.